a well-known politician superimposed upon the head of what looks like a horse, although someone has suggested that it could actually be a donkey. Some contractors working on a building next door have seen it and have been heard laughing and joking about the picture during morning break. So those are the first three scenarios that await us this morning. How would you resolve these scenarios if you were put in charge of negotiating these issues? Call or text into the show live and we will hear from anybody who has a view on these. Otherwise, we will work through them one by one and see what we might be able to do in the circumstances that we find ourselves. So just a quick reminder of these three scenarios. And then again, the first scenario, the battle between the head of Spanish and the head of Italian on the nature of assessments that have been set for year 12. The head of Spanish seems annoyed that the Italian assessments are too easy and that therefore Spanish students might end up dropping Spanish in favour of Italian. You've been asked to comment on that. You've been asked to mediate, I suppose, with the head of English and the head of art who've come to speak to you because they're unhappy with your brand new assessment policy that you have introduced at the end of last year, and they've now realised they're going to have to implement in the classroom from this term. And then our third scenario is the caricature of a UK politician that's been found on the back of on the side of the technology block, graffitied onto the side of the technology block, and some contractors working on a nearby building site have seen it and have been heard laughing and joking about the picture during morning break. Those are the three scenarios we've been presented with this morning. Be interested to know what you would do in each of those cases, which of these scenarios you might prioritize. Now, it's clearly, I suppose, a set of scenarios that are lending themselves to different kinds of approaches. If we think about our first scenario, the issue of clashes within the school between departments, that's going to be potentially political. There's going to be some fact finding we need to do in the case of that particular scenario. It may not be that we have all the evidence to hand straight away. The head of Spanish has come to you. We don't perhaps know what kind of history the Spanish department and the Italian department have in the past, but it's certainly something perhaps that we should at the very least offer some reassuring words on in the first instance. The second scenario perhaps is a bit more complicated. Now, you are in many ways, the source of the issue, as your new assessment policy has so annoyed the head of English and the head of art that they've come to you to tell you so. So there's something we're going to have to do there that's going to have to be a little bit more careful. We've already set up a whole scheme of working towards testing our students on what they know and the skills they possess. We can't simply cast everything aside in favour, perhaps, of two members of staff. If this assessment policy is to be rolled out across the school and is designed to bring benefits in terms of consistency, better student understanding of where they might sit in their academic learning, then it's not something we can simply abandon because two members of staff have come to speak to us. It's not to say we can't perhaps make some kinds of adjustments, but it's certainly something that we would need to think quite carefully about. It's probably a scenario that I would be less keen to make a snap decision on. The third one, the issue of the graffiti on the technology block. Now, that's a relatively simple one to fix, one would suspect, in the first instance. So I think in the first instance, what we do here is we get our estates care team, we get our caretaker and his staff to get on and do their best to try and remove that caricature as quickly as they possibly can. The contractors that we might have overheard laughing and joking about this picture. Well, not really very much we can do about them. They're not on our school site. They're perhaps the kinds of people that we may expect to be just distracted from their work for a brief time and then returning to it. Perhaps they've made some photographs to share with their mates. Perhaps it's something that might appear for a brief time on perhaps social media, perhaps somewhere else. If we can get rid of that caricature quickly off the side of the building, then I think essentially that problem is resolved. I think we would need to conduct some kind of investigation into how it arrived there. If we've got any CCTV television pictures on our campus, we might be inclined to ask security to have a look at those. If we haven't, it's something we could perhaps direct our tutors to keep an ear out for, perhaps as students move from class to class along the corridors, perhaps as they engage in the occasional piece of off-task chatter to pick up whether there's some kind of group involved in producing this unconventional piece of artwork. I mean, I'm thinking back to my time when I was at high school myself, and there was a particular area of our school site. It was a relatively large school site for a school of our type. Right on the edge of the city, lots and lots of sports pitches around the main site. You had to drive for a fair way into the site before you actually encountered the main buildings. And there was always the area of the CCF hut. And it seemed to me that whenever we would pass the CCF hut, there would always be some new work of art on display for the school community to appreciate. Quite often it wasn't necessarily the kind of artwork that you would wish to have circulating around the city, but it was certainly something that was a kind of ritual. Very, very bad drawings appeared on the back of the building. The way around that eventually was some kind of graffiti retardant paint that was used to remedy that problem in the medium to longer term. Later on, of course, when we got a bit older, we would return to the school and we would look around the school. We'd go and visit our friends and our siblings as we came back for various reunion events, after school events. It would be the kind of thing you would look back on now with some kind of embarrassment, I would suspect. But these things do happen within schools. So those are the three scenarios that we've been asked to engage with. The assessment policy mutiny is the one I think is perhaps the most important of all of these. Let's imagine the scenario. We've been put in charge of redesigning an assessment policy for the entire school population. It's something that's been delegated to us. It's something that we have ultimate responsibility for. It's something that we're going to have to follow through on once we've introduced it. As the scenario stands at the moment, I suppose there are questions we would want to ask about how we arrived at the decision that was made to introduce the assessment policy in its current form. Now, an assessment policy change of this magnitude in most schools, you would hope would have some kind of buy-in from staff before it gets up and running. So before it leaves the drawing board, you would hope to have some kind of input from all departments into this assessment policy and how it might work for students. So for the sake of argument, let's assume this assessment policy requires students in all subjects to be assessed in a formal way every 2 weeks of the year, with those assessment results being documented and recorded in our data management system. So students can then be tracked as they progress from assessment to assessment throughout the year. This does, of course, raise a number of problems for particular kinds of subjects. One can imagine in the maths and sciences that it might be a relatively good thing, a relatively straightforward task to assess students on a 2 weekly basis. You might offer them 2 weeks worth of knowledge. The 2 weeks worth of knowledge might fit conveniently into a scheme of work relating to a specific topic, which can then be tested perhaps once the students have gained some basic understanding of the concepts, have been able to do some practice tasks at home perhaps, and can then reproduce some of the skills they've learnt in some kind of formal assessment scenario. It may well work very well for those particular kinds of subjects. Now, if we were to think about subjects like history or English or art, as is the case here, one wonders how much progress a student really makes in 2 weeks. Whether it is possible to distill those subjects down into 2-week chunks, when perhaps in English a student might be studying a set text for the best part of a year. In art, a student might be working towards producing some kind of work of art, some kind of portrait, picture, sculpture, some kind of product of that nature, so that the 2-week assessment policy doesn't really fit. The question I think this raises is the degree to which departments have to be left with some kind of autonomy as they go about planning their courses of teaching, their courses of learning, and their systems for assessing students. I'm not sure I would want my English students to be assessed every 2 weeks in my school. At the moment, my students are in year 12, just about to start studying 2 tragedy texts. They're about to study the play Death of a Salesman with one of their teachers, and they're about to study the play Othello with another of their teachers. So with our students having 6 periods a fortnight with each teacher, so 12 periods a fortnight across the 2-week timetable frame that we use in our school, they're not going to make a huge amount of progress in 2 weeks. By the time we've explained to them what tragedy is and what tragedy does, how tragedians like to engage audiences with the content that they're presenting to them, about how we discuss the ways in which characters conform to particular types in tragedy, then we're quite soon going to be running up to the 2-week period. And if we're wanting our students to really engage with the front-loaded course content, then I would be a little reluctant to have our students assessed after 2 weeks. In the same way, those students who are studying an Othello play are going to make relatively slow progress in 2 weeks. We might just about be into the first couple of scenes of the play, and it's really quite difficult to set students meaningful English literature assessments after only 2 weeks of studying a book. So I think there's a question we have to ask here about how hasty we were in designing this assessment policy in the first place. How much buy-in did we get from other departments in the school? What kind of opinions did we canvass before we set forth upon this plan for redesigning the way in which subjects are assessed and the way in which our teachers prepare students for those assessments? One thing I've found over the course of my teaching career is the more frequent your assessments tend to be, the more frequent the expectation is that there's some kind of significant preparation work done prior to the assessment so that students are able to engage with the assessments in a way that they've been pre-trained for. Now, if you push this to its logical degree and give students more and more preparation as they move into more and more assessments, you actually squeeze out time for learning to make time for learning the assessment methodology. So it's a particular trap that I think we need to be aware of when we're making these kinds of decisions about how students should be assessed in their subjects. For those of you who are just joining us live, we're in the process of working through some management scenarios, crisis management scenarios, as we've been left in charge of the school. And we're dealing with 3 scenarios that have cropped up, and people have come to us looking for solutions during the course of the morning before lunchtime in our school day. And these are the scenarios we've encountered so far. As we've just been discussing, we've been presented with a rebellion from the head of English and the head of art on the new assessment policy that's been introduced this term. And we were the architects of that assessment policy at the end of the summer term last year. So we've just been talking through some of the issues that might arise out of that decision. The first scenario we were asked to deal with was the head of Spanish coming in to suggest that the head of Italian had in fact made his assessments too easy and was essentially poaching students from Spanish by giving students inflated grades in Italian. And then the third scenario was an unflattering caricature of a UK politician has appeared on the side of our technology block. But I think we've already dealt with that one. That's being painted away as we speak by our caretakers and our estate staff. So we're live this evening. So if you're listening in and would like to call the show via Podbean, then please feel free to do that. Be interested to hear your thoughts on particularly the assessment scenario that I've presented to you this evening, and also whether you have any memories of clashes between departments when it comes to the assessment round and Year 12 students making their firm decisions about what they should be following as A-level subjects through the rest of their time in the sixth form. Particularly keen to hear from you this evening on that. No text coming in just yet, but if you feel you want to come and text the show to comment on how you would resolve some of these problems, then please feel free to do so. We'll pick up these as we go through the chat, and I'll be delighted to hear from any of you who have personal experience of some of these scenarios, or perhaps have your own solutions to some of the problems that we face in our course, in the course of our morning here today. Going back to our assessment policy issue that has arisen, one wonders if we were to make these assessments quite so regular as every 2 weeks, how some departments would conceivably get through the moderation process. One thing I've noticed as a consequence of working on tags this year as the head of an English department with a relatively small number of students, but still significant when you're working through the paperwork, is the amount of time that is taken up by the actual moderation process if it's done properly. So in the course of our tags work this year, we teach English literature at A-level. We have about 20 students in our cohort for A-level. We have about 82 students for GCSE, and our students do GCSE English language and they do IGCSE English literature. By the time we decided what evidence we were going to assess students on, that evidence amounted to about 1,400 individual pieces of work over the course of the May summer term, and all of those pieces of work required moderation. So I'd be interested to hear how you got on if you were in that same kind of position as we were. So we were working through these moderation processes, working through the paperwork, and we found ourselves having to spend a lot of time investigating the way in which the students have reached their grades and the performances they're put in. I've got a caller from Picarella. Is that you, Picarella? Can't get my call. If you'd like to call into the show, then please do feel free to call into the show, and we will pick up your point in our conversation this evening. So, as I was saying, we had to essentially moderate about 1,400 individual assessments, and those assessments were shared between 4 markers, with essentially 2 moderators, myself and my assistant head of department, working through those assessments. So it took a lot of time. Even that small number of students for whom we were responsible took a lot of time to get through that work. If we were to push our assessments to every 2 weeks and we were to do this on a regular basis, I'm not quite sure how sustainable it would be in the medium term. It would really be quite tricky, I think, for us to work through that amount of paperwork on a kind of 2 weekly basis for the rest of the foreseeable future. So one thing I think we do need to bear in mind is the degree to which proper assessment requires proper moderation of work. I wonder how much more tight moderation procedures were for tags this year than perhaps they were for a standard assessment that's done in schools. Now, of course, if we want assessments to produce data that we can make reliable decisions on, as this scenario seems to be suggesting would be the case in our school, then it's really important that that data is as accurate as we can make it. And in subjects like history, subjects like English, subjects like religious studies, where the essay form does play quite a significant part in the assessment process, it's really quite important that that work is checked thoroughly on a regular basis, because any assessment grade or any assessment flag that comes out of that process is going to require us to make further judgments down the line. And it's important for us to make sure that we make the right judgments as we move forward. In terms of the rebellion we've got from our head of English, it'd be worth perhaps sharing one little anecdote that I remember from a previous school that I worked at. In this particular school, inner city London school, London Academy, I was responsible for the Key Stage 5 English Literature programme, and it was in the days where we had AS and A2 exams. So we prepared our students for AS exams in Year 12, and then our students completed their A2 exams in Year 13. And what we actually noticed as we went through the course of running this syllabus in the short time that it was available to us, which is a shame because it was a good syllabus, was that actually our best set of results that we ever had while we were following this syllabus came without actually doing regular assessments and without actually doing formal trial exams, incredibly. Because of the way the AS and the A2 system worked, we took the decision that it was the best thing to do to put our students in for the AS exam as soon as possible. So our students sat AS exams we had some quite reliable data as far as assessment data go in English literature, because not only did we have the moderated results of the AS exams that students had sat at just after Christmas, but we also had the students' coursework, which we'd already provisionally marked and we had a fair idea as to the standard that the students were performing at. So by the time we went into the second year of A-level, we had a very strong idea indeed of what students might finish on, and where students were short of where we wanted them to be or where they wanted to be themselves for their university entrance requirements. It was very clear to us which steps we would take to get them through the exams they needed to resit. By the time our students reached A2, we had a handful of students who were resitting AS and A2 exams in English Lit with the intention of collecting A stars. We had students who were already on very strong AS and A2 coursework as far as we were concerned as a centre. So in their cases, it was about taking exams that were optional to them, perhaps just to collect that extra number of UMS points to push them over a threshold. But it was very, very clear. The data showed us a very clear pathway towards the marks that we thought students should be reasonably aiming for. The issue I sometimes have with internal assessments in schools is that they very often don't factor in the time that is required for that rigorous moderation to take place, so that you sometimes end up with a set of scores that are in fact unreliable. They compound a number of different variables. They're often made up of work that students have completed at slightly different times, because as soon as you set an assessment policy, I think, that is more frequent than every half term, you inevitably run into the student absences that push students back behind their peers and can make things very messy indeed for the departments in terms of catching up student work. The student's away for a week ill, suddenly finds they have 15 to 20 assessments to do in the space of a couple of days. And that isn't really my sense of what education should be about in the 21st century. If my assessment policy that I've introduced here in my scenario is something that's going to look a bit like controlled assessment, then I think we need to be very, very wary indeed as the direction of travel in terms of this policy. I'm not sure we really do want our students being constantly assessed. Continuously assessed, of course, is something different from being constantly assessed. I'm not quite sure necessarily that constantly assessing students in formal scenarios gives us perhaps the evidence and data we need. So if we return to our three scenarios that we've been asked to investigate before morning break, this is my set of solutions in the absence of any callers this evening in this first half of the show. For the first scenario regarding the trade-off between Italian and Spanish, I think we're going to need to get both of those people into the room. We're going to need to look at any assessment data that we do have already and perhaps consider any variable trends that have taken place historically at this particular point in the year. If it does transpire that our head of Italian is setting assessments that are far too easy for year 12 students, then a conversation will probably need to be had there about setting things that are perhaps slightly more appropriate, perhaps asking the head of Spanish and the head of Italian to work more closely together on the nature of their assessments so they look broadly, if not comparable, then certainly useful enough for us to draw comparisons between those two subjects at some later point. So perhaps asking the head of Italian and the head of Spanish, where their subjects permit, to perhaps test a similar skill at the same time, perhaps to test a similar topic at the same time, perhaps if they're following the same board, to look at using papers that are broadly comparable within their subject domains. So we might get perhaps some more reliable data from there. So the first scenario really, I suppose, is about reliability of data and reliability of the assessments upon which that data is based. Second scenario, our assessment policy, I think we're going to need to listen here to the head of English and the head of art. We should really have done our listening last term, but if we haven't done our listening last term, then now I think is the time to do some basic, simple listening at this early stage. and thereafter perhaps to organise a meeting to look at some flexibility that we might afford to the English and the art departments so that their staff can get through their curriculum content, securing the knowledge that the students are actually learning to a worthwhile degree before sitting any assessments that we might have designed to come their way. It's certainly something that we might want to investigate with the students, perhaps conduct some form of student voice focus group. I would suggest in the first instance, rather than student voice survey. Are the heads of English and the head of art speaking on behalf of the students they teach? So in other words, are they simply relaying complaints they are getting from students about how the nature of their subject has changed since last term? Or is there something else going on here? I think really if the nature of the learning experience in the classroom has been made less appealing or less engaging as a consequence of our assessment policy, then perhaps it's going to need some tweaking as we move through the year. One wouldn't want to start off by suggesting that an assessment policy that was causing problems in some departments would be steamrolled across the school for the rest of the year. So there are certainly conversations that need to happen here. So those were our 3 morning scenarios. And in the second half of the show, I'd be interested in hearing how you, dear listener, might deal with the 3rd, 4th, 5th, 6th, and 7th scenarios that await us after lunch, because things are going to get slightly more tricky. So far, we've dealt with 3 scenarios that are fairly familiar to most people who've worked in schools. One is always negotiating, I think, issues between staff in the school environment. One is always dealing with issues of property being perhaps misused in schools, and our graffiti issue certainly covers that one. And we're always being asked to ensure that our students are making progress. So assessment is always going to be a live issue in our schools. A live issue because the teachers are the ones who have to administer it. A live issue because students are the ones that experience this assessment, but also because we're ultimately accountable for the assessment strategies that we have employed in our schools and are going to be held to account when the inspectors come in and when the grade tables are published once we move back to league tables again in the not so distant future, I suspect. So those were our 3 scenarios for the first half of the show. The second half of the show is going to bring us some slightly different scenarios. So these are the problems you face after lunch. So we've dealt with our 3 morning scenarios. Here's what happens next. Scenario 4, it's lunchtime. It's 1:15 in the afternoon, and a student has suffered a minor wrist sprain playing rugby in a PE lesson. The child's parent wants the boy taken off of rugby for the remainder of the term in PE. Rugby is the only option offered to boys in that year group this term. The parent wants to speak to you later this afternoon to find out about what steps you're taking to improve the safety of rugby in your school. So the first scenario for the lunchtime then is this rugby injury scenario. Second scenario, lunchtime, 1:30, an angry neighbour arrives at reception to say that some of your boys have climbed over his garden wall to retrieve their football for the 3rd time this week. But on this occasion, they have seriously damaged the competition entry runner beans that he has been growing for 6 months for next week's county agricultural show. This man is a bit of a local celebrity in the regional press. So our third scenario, angry neighbour, wider community. His prize runner beans that he's going to claim first prize with, he suspects, in the local agricultural show, ruined. He's come to take it out on you because, of course, everything your students do in school is ultimately your responsibility. Scenario 6. The afternoon passes without event. However, it is now 6 p.m. You receive a phone call from an outside speaker who is due to speak to your sixth form students about university choices at 7 p.m. She tells you that her train has been delayed and she won't be able to arrive until 9 p.m. Your event is due to finish at 9:30 p.m. Okay, so those are our next three scenarios. So the first of these scenarios is boy injured playing rugby, parent wants to talk to you about it. Scenario 2, after lunch, angry neighbours, prize runner beans destroyed in football retrieval carnage by, let's say, year 10, as they climb over the fence into his garden again. And then the third scenario is your speaker at your showpiece event is going to be so late that it's almost not worth perhaps running to the normal time schedule, or perhaps moving the day. That causes further problems, of course, or indeed the time on the evening. So I'd be interested to hear what you might think about those. So those are our three scenarios. I think perhaps we ought to unpack these three as we've done with the other three scenarios that we had before lunchtime. Got one message here from Rogers History 1 saying, ha, 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 goodness me, these aren't easy. Indeed, rugby issue, runner bean issue, parents' evening issue, essentially, are our three issues that we've got here. So I think in terms of severity here, perhaps the late running of our speaker could cause us some problems. So we'll have a little think about that one. Of course, if this were to happen in the real sequence of events, we'd have to have a spur of the moment response to that one. What I think I would do here is I've got an hour before my speaker is due to start. I've got all of my sixth form parents and all of my sixth form students probably gathered in my main hall waiting to hear from them. I suppose I've got a couple of solutions. Solutions perhaps that I wouldn't have conceived of prior to COVID. One wonders if we actually need the speaker to physically come in at all. Perhaps there's some relatively stable position from which our speaker could talk to our students remotely via the internet. So perhaps this is one scenario whereby our visiting speaker could perhaps find a nice quiet space. Perhaps if they're in a station, perhaps move away from the station. Perhaps if they're in a big station where they might find they could use some kind of first-class lounge, whether they might find some office space in the station from which to deliver their talk. Perhaps that might be a scenario that would enable the talk to go ahead more or less on time, or perhaps we might find some way of them recording their talk and then sending it on to us for us to put it on live to the parents in the hall. So that's one potential solution. Technology may do it for us. However, having worked with some mobile technology myself over the holiday period while on Dartmoor, I'm wary of perhaps using Wi-Fi signals to conduct lengthy video calls. But certainly perhaps even if it's just an audio talk, that might be something that we could offer. One solution, of course, is to perhaps extend the finish time of our parents' evening. That may annoy some parents, but it may not do. You know, if they've come all this way already, then perhaps if we were to extend our parents' evening by an extra half hour for the benefit of having the speaker arrive live and perform their presentation to the group in the hall, then that might be the way forward. Of course, as soon as you've accepted that you will delay the presentation, this is sometimes the problem with running to schedules. There's no guarantee, of course, that our speaker will turn up at 9 p.m. So we're going to have to set some kind of cut-off time, rather like in Test cricket, beyond which no further play is possible. So that's one solution, perhaps just to push back the timings. I'd be reluctant to cancel the evening just because the speaker can't make it. We might be able to schedule some other kind of opportunity for students and staff to hear from our particular speaker further in the term. So we might perhaps find a way around the problem that way. We could, of course, get our eminently well qualified staff to deliver something similar, although I wouldn't quite want to do that at the very last moment myself. But perhaps if we've got some member of staff who is confident to do that, then that's another solution. Another alternative might be to fill that space that is available to us with a Q&A session that our parents or students might generate questions and answers, so that our sixth form team could perhaps question time style offer them some answers in place of the advertised speaker. So there are a couple of scenarios we could use as solutions for scenario 6. Our delayed speaker, it's always nerve-wracking when you've got speakers traveling a long distance, particularly if they're traveling over 200 miles or so to visit your school that is in remote rural England. Quite troubling. There's so many things that could go wrong, even after they've got off the train at the station that is 30 miles away from your school. We've got a couple of texts coming in from our listeners. So Roger's Histories one is interested to know what my answer to the rugby scenario might be. We might go through that one in a minute. Complex has come up with the quite radical suggestion of getting our runner bean neighbour to come in to give a talk while waiting for the keynote. I think that could be quite apocalyptic if we were to invite them to do that, but it's certainly a possible solution, although not one I would perhaps put into practice myself if I wanted to stay in my job. But yeah, there's certainly some challenges there, aren't there? Of these three scenarios, I think the most difficult one to resolve is the overrunning speaker, actually, of these three scenarios. If we go back to look at our rugby scenario, then of course we've got the problem here of a particular member of a year group, let's say again it's year 10, who has injured themselves playing rugby. It's a minor injury. Rugby, of course, is a sport in which injuries will occur, but this is one of the more minor injuries when we think of injuries on the scale or the spectrum that we might have in rugby, where we have a number of questions really surrounding the issue of rugby in schools. It's been on the agenda for quite a long time now. We have, of course, had changes to the concussion policy in schools that have been brought in by the rugby authorities. All of these, I think, are welcome changes to the sport. Roger's History says, I went to a rugby school and hated it. Indeed, I went to a rugby playing school myself too. I went to school in Exeter. I went to probably the leading rugby school in Exeter at the time. It was a time when Exeter Rugby Club were essentially nobodies, largely plying their trade in the minor divisions of the national rugby pyramid. In fact, it wasn't really even a pyramid at that time, I seem to remember. I used to watch my sports teacher, who used to play number 8 for Exeter Rugby Club, essentially practicing in our local park. Now, when I look at the standing of Exeter Rugby Club, who are now, of course, known as Exeter Chiefs, and the position they hold in the international pyramid of rugby, then it's quite a miraculous rise that they've gone through over the years. But yeah, I wasn't a particularly keen rugby player myself at school. we had some extremely good rugby players in our school team. We had some extremely good rugby players in my school year group. And that's why I wasn't particularly interested in rugby, because we had a number of players, if you can imagine them, kind of 6'2", 6'3" by the time they're in year 9, year 10, weighing a fair amount, as broad almost as they are tall, colliding with a bookish boy in year 10 who'd much rather sit around and read Edgar Allan Poe horror stories and be out on the rugby pitch. It wasn't necessarily always a good mix. In fact, there's one particular PE lesson I can remember when we were playing rugby, and we were playing rugby for some reason on a reduced length pitch. I think because a couple of the other pitches were out of action, so we had to divide the pitch that we were playing on into two. So we had two games going on at different ends of the pitch. So the try line, I think that's what it's called, was marked out with a series of cones, and I'd never ever scored a single point in a single PE rugby practice match, or indeed in a house rugby match, and I didn't play too many of those. I managed to get myself deselected quite quickly. I picked up the ball, I think, somewhere towards the end of the pitch that we start on at the beginning of the match, and I managed to run Forrest Gump-like from one end of the pitch to the other end of the pitch, miraculously, because I wasn't particularly quick as a rugby player carrying a rugby ball, and our opponents were quite good really at sending you flying relatively easily, because they put the full weight of their expertise behind the tackle as they went in, relatively low as you charged down the pitch. Anyway, I ran so far with the rugby ball before putting it down that I'd actually overrun the try line at the other end of the ground, and I thought I'd scored my one and only try in my entire history at the school, but in fact I hadn't. I just run the ball straight out of touch to the other end of the ground. Now, because I was quite keen on American football around about this time, this is kind of, I suppose, early to mid 90s, when Blitz was on TV on Sunday mornings, I wasn't actually aware that you could run the ball beyond the end of the try line, because of course in American football, once you've reached the end zone, then destination complete. You usually throw the ball as hard as you can on the ground, perform some kind of peculiar robotic dance move, and then run to accept the adulation of your teammates. But on this occasion, there was no adulation on offer. I'd just been told that I'd run the ball beyond the try line and that the game would resume. I was mortified, I have to say. It's the one moment of my rugby playing career, short-lived as it was, that sticks in my memory. The particular injury I hated most receiving in rugby was that kind of injury when you've flown into a tackle, and if you're a year 10 boy with skinny legs and bony ankles, you've managed to land in such a way that you've managed to essentially stud yourself in your own ankle with one of your own rugby boots, and you come limping in to the boiling hot showers on a freezing cold, what shall we say, October. Well, no, October's not too bad in the southwest. November Tuesday morning, and you've completely, your ankle is completely purple, and then you step into the shower and the rest of your body is completely red, and then you step into your clothes and then head off to your next lesson. So in the instance here of our rugby playing boy who's managed to injure himself, we've got two options really. I suppose the first option is to ask the boy himself what he would like to do. It could be that the boy wants to play rugby, and it could be that the parent is trying to overly manage the child's life for them. But it could be that the child actually doesn't really like rugby at all and doesn't really want to be there. And I think we'd need to do a bit more exploration of that. So we'd need to talk to the boy. I think I'd want to talk to the parent. I think I'd want to suggest to the parent that if our school is a rugby playing school, and if our parent has chosen our school in the full awareness that our school is a rugby playing school, then our boys play rugby unless they have some kind of physical reason why they can't do, or some kind of mental or health condition, or why they can't do, physical condition why they can't do, then we would normally expect our boys to be out on the rugby field for PE. Now, it doesn't mean to say that we'd expect our boys to be representing the school in our rugby teams. And I certainly didn't represent my school in my rugby team. I represented my house in a house rugby competition once, and I think, well, in fact, more than once, because there are 2 or 3 games in the tournament. But I didn't compete beyond that tournament in year 10. And my name never appeared on the list again, which is something I was more than happy to see happen. So we've got a question really, I suppose, about what the boys' commitment is to rugby and how the parent sees rugby in the life or the culture of the school. Now, in many, by no means all, many, certainly all boys' schools, rugby in some parts of the country can be quite a big deal. My experience tends to be that your school is either a rugby school or a football school. And my school, when I was in when I was in secondary school, happened to be a rugby school, and I was a football enthusiast. I liked to play football. I'd played football up until the age of about 12, 13, virtually every Saturday or Sunday for my local club team in this case. But I wasn't keen on rugby. Rugby didn't really do it for me. I couldn't quite understand it. It was a strange game played by too many people on the pitch. And the other thing that put me off rugby in school was the degree to which we were never allowed to kick the ball, despite the fact that whenever I used to watch England on television, that seemed to be the vast majority of what they were doing. Complex makes the very valid point that it should be the boy or the girl's decision as to whether they play rugby or not. I think that's a good point. Certainly would be the first place I would go, perhaps, after reassuring the parent that we would be looking into it. Of course, if the only option for this particular term is rugby or nothing, then the boy has a couple of options. They might want to perhaps participate in the PE lesson from a kind of spectator or official's point of view, perhaps learning more about the sport if it's something they are interested in but don't want to get involved in physically, because I think there's some elements of social inclusion perhaps that might be going on here too that we wouldn't want to leave the boy out of. If the boy is not particularly keen to participate in rugby, so if the boy was somebody like me, then we might have to look at which specific kinds of options we might provide that are tailored to that boy's particular interest. It might be perhaps that we find some other activity for the boy to be involved in. But if PE is compulsory in our school, and if the PE option that is available to our school is rugby in this term or nothing else, then perhaps there's a slightly more difficult question we might have to ask ourselves about what further PE provision we make for our students. Complex says there are plenty of sports. Indeed, there may well be, but we're thinking here perhaps about the way in which our sports are divided up across the year. Perhaps we might have a few weeks where we play rugby, and then a few weeks where we play football, and then a few weeks where we play hockey in the winter term. That's certainly the way it was run at my high school when I was a boy. But I recognise things have moved on considerably since then. So I'd be interested to hear whether you have any particular thoughts on this PE scenario. In terms of the safety of rugby itself, I think we have to provide the parents with reassurance here and with our policy documents and our policy processes. If we were to have a serious injury on the rugby field, do we have the medical facilities to take care of those students? Do we have the means to treat them quickly and effectively? Do we have the confidence to make sure that we make the right decision on the touchline about not sending the child back into the match? Of course, current rugby protocol is that if the student suffers a head injury, they're immediately withdrawn from the game and play no further part until they have had quite significant concussion checks and concussion protocols conducted by medical professionals. So that's our rugby issue. I think it's certainly something that we might expect to crop up from time to time. One of the most frustrating things about being an English teacher sometimes in a school where rugby is played pretty much all the way down the year group in most year groups. So most of our boys turn out for a rugby team of some sort on Saturday afternoons as they take on other schools, various levels of competitiveness. One of the most frustrating things for an English teacher is when the student damages their writing hand just before a significant essay is due in. And they can't clearly do any handwritten work, and they're not yet skilled enough to do any typing, so struggle to engage with your English lessons for the remainder of the term while their hand sits in a splint perched on the desk. Now, that's been a significant frustration for me over recent years. The student who arrives having busted their hand playing rugby and then can't actually do any work, because of course all English teachers ever want their students to do is to speak, to listen, to read and to write. And when people come into your English classes to check you're actually doing some English, they like to see children writing, because writing is actually some kind of action that can be measured and can be judged. So the sports injury that prevents students from participating in long form writing can be quite troublesome. Rogers History one says they're faking it. Well, yeah, sadly, they often come with a note that suggests they're not. Complex says that's where technology can help. Sometimes it can, but sometimes it's difficult to have those students using dictation software in your room. But certainly, again, technology offers us a potential solution. Wouldn't it be great if technology offered us a potential solution for rugby injuries, be they minor or severe? So that was our rugby scenario. Be interested to know what you would do in that position. Listeners, how would you resolve that particular problem? Is there something you would say to the parent? Would you let your particular student take the rest of the time of the rugby session off of PE? It's a difficult one. They're required to do PE. Perhaps we might have to look into offering students a greater range of choices. Often, of course, when you're in a school, particularly if you've got a relatively small staff body, it can be quite difficult to put on maybe 3 or 4 sporting activities during PE for your boys and for your girls. So it's quite often perhaps the reason why schools tend to fall back on their specialist winter sports and their specialist summer sports. Interestingly, it always seemed we had a lot more choice when it came to summer sports at my high school, because my school was a cricket school and an athletics school and a tennis school and a swimming school, so and a gymnastics school. So once we had those particular options available to you, the summer term became a bit easier. Of course, as soon as you invite cricket into the equation, you then got the frustration of students going off for 5-6 hours at a time from your lessons to hear the sound of leather on willow as the ball travels to the boundary from the square outside your window. So again, the tension between sporting performance in your schools and academic engagement can sometimes be a real one. And it can be something that sometimes causes particular challenges that need to be addressed quite tactfully, particularly where you move between departments or where you have the expectations of parents from outside come in to affect what you do in your curriculum. So in this scenario then, we speak to the parent, we outline to them the measures that we have in place to ensure that the degree of injuries that students might pick up playing rugby are minimised as far as is practical in a full contact sport like rugby. We offer them the option of the student perhaps continuing to participate in a different group if they wish to. Perhaps they're in a group that is inappropriate for the student's own physical stature. I can relate to that myself personally. Perhaps there's some other sport we might offer. Perhaps there's some other opportunity that could be grouped within the heading of PE that we can offer to this particular student. And again, that's something we could discuss with our head of PE and look at in terms of the timetable we can offer and the shape of our day. The weird scenario then. The angry neighbour who arrives at reception to say that some of your boys have climbed over his garden wall to retrieve their football for the third time this week, but on this occasion they have seriously damaged the competition entry runner beans that he has been growing for 6 months for next week's county agricultural show. This man is a bit of a celebrity in the local newspapers. Well, here I think, but for the grace of God go I think is the best way to explain this. When I was at middle school, we had a big football field, but it used to back directly onto a series of terraced houses. We had a relatively flimsy chicken wire fence, essentially dividing us between the school and the neighbouring community. And when you played football at lunchtime in the field, particularly in the summer months, surprise, surprise, there would always be that student in one of the teams who, John Smith's advert style, would hoof the ball inexplicably 50 feet up into the air at the edge of the pitch, leaving it sailing over the fence and then bouncing twice and landing in the garden next door. And the general principle that seemed to apply in my year group at that time was that whichever fool had hoofed the ball over the fence would be the one who would have to climb over and get it. Now, when I was playing football at school, I used to play at centre back. So when I used to represent my school team at centre back, my job was basically to stop the opposition getting anywhere near our goalkeeper. And there were various strategies we had for that. And then the second key performance indicator was how well you could hoof the ball out of play if it looked like it was going anywhere near your goal. And I was quite good at that. So one of these days, it was my job to climb over the fence and retrieve the ball. Fortunately, on this occasion, the ball had missed the quite significant greenhouse nearby in the garden, but it was certainly an heart-in-mouth experience, and I counted every one of those seconds as I moved across the garden, across the fence, down the other side, along the garden path. So certainly something that sticks in my memory. We've got Hassan with us. Hassan, welcome to the show this evening. What would you like to say?
Hello, thank you very much. I would just like to listen, and I have my note with me, writing down the wisdom going on here. Thank you.
And which wisdom have you picked up? Have you picked up any wisdom this evening?
I've recently joined.
You recently joined. Well, in this case, this is our scenario. Do you know what's going on at the moment? So you've been put in charge of the school. A local neighbour has come round wanting to speak to you because one of our boys has climbed over the garden wall and damaged his prize runner beans, which he intends to enter for an agricultural show. And this man is a celebrity in the local newspapers. How do you think you might respond to this angry neighbour if you found yourself in this position?
I'd just tell them to calm down, really. I mean, there is no other way to approach them because they're angry, and I don't really like angry people. When people lose their temper, it's not cool.
So it's certainly a job we need to do in terms of calming our neighbour down. I think I agree with you there. I think we're going to have to express some kind of sorrow on behalf of the school and the students, because of course students do things all the time. Students do stupid things. They make rash decisions. They make poor judgments. That's what we expect of students. Their judgment faculty develops as they age. So I think you're right, Hassan. We're going to have to calm him down. Is there anything you think our students could do on behalf of the school to rectify this scenario in any way?
Hi, everybody. Hi, teacher.
Hi, Hannah. Good to speak to you.
Thank you for joining me. I'm sorry. Actually, it's an interesting topic that, like, the way that the kids take sometimes the aggressive way, and we have to handle. I mean, we need to handle this all the time. And when sometimes their parents are supporting them. I mean, even they do very bad dates. Sometimes you find that, like, the parents trying to support their kids, whatever is the situation, even if they're wrong. And that is a problem. Then that is a problem, really. You can't convince them that is not like the appropriate behavior. So sometimes I really need to even know about the whole issue. Why would this kids act like this? I mean, psychologically and things.
Which particular issue are you referring to here? Which scenario is this you've called in about?
If the kid did something like aggressive, like he like hit his maid or do something aggressive, whatever it is. I'm not talking about a specific. I'm not talking about a specific scenario. I'm talking in general.
I'd be interested to know what you think about this scenario, though, because it does ring a bell with something I experienced when I was at school myself. So the scenario is your school backs immediately onto a series of terraced houses, rather like my middle school did back in the day when I was in short trousers. And a neighbour in that house has had his prize runner beans that are going to win him first prize in the local agricultural show ruined, destroyed, because your boys have climbed over his wall to get their football back for the third time this week. I wonder if there's anything we could get the boys to do to learn from this scenario themselves, Hannah. Do you think there's any lesson we could draw that we could teach our students as a consequence of this scenario?
I don't know. I actually I'll go with the same thing that Hassan did. Like, I'm gonna to keep telling them that you have to calm down and take it easy and like go the soft way. I'm not gonna like give him a lecture because maybe they're not gonna listen to me at the beginning. But I don't know, when something like that happened to me to one of my students, I'll prefer to like know more about their history to know why would they do this. Then I can figure it out. But I'm not gonna give them advice, free advice, without knowing about the whole thing, their life, the thing that they've been through.
Okay, that's certainly something you'd want to. Would you want to talk to the students about this situation? Do you think?
Yeah, I guess because they're not gonna listen. But I can't talk to their parents, or I can't talk to someone who can understand the whole thing. Maybe in the beginning, like they're not gonna accept it from me. I don't know. I have. Mm-hmm.
What are the circumstances in your school, Hannah?
I don't know. It's a normal thing. But sometimes people like the student trying to do something like they hit each other. They like bullying each other. Sometimes they're doing bad things, like they're trying to make fun at someone, erode his confidence. Sometimes they do things like that.
They certainly do. I suppose in those circumstances, though, it's perhaps easier to negotiate a solution within the school because there's conflicts between students within the school. But in this case here, we've got a potential issue with somebody outside of our school who's a member of the local community. One thing I might think of here as a solution is perhaps we might organise some kind of student working party, perhaps, to go and help tidy up the garden that they've destroyed as a consequence of their inability to control a football on the sports field. so that the neighbors, we start to rebuild that relationship with the neighbor. We clearly can't fix the runner beans for the for the agricultural show that's down the road, but this could be some guy in his 60s, retired, looking to enjoy the life in his back garden, perhaps grow some runner beans, perhaps grow some marrows. He's had his property invaded, hasn't he, by our students'
Mm-hmm.
carelessness. Is there a message we could perhaps impart to our students here about wider consideration for the greater community of which the school is a part?
Mm-hmm. I got it. Yeah, but I guess some like things are different here in Egypt. Like it's I'm originally from Egypt, so it's a little bit different here. That's why I'm using this. So I'm talking like this.
I'm interested. So, in terms of Egypt, whereabouts are you in Egypt?
I'll beg your pardon. Come again.
Whereabouts are you in Egypt, Hannah?
I don't get it actually. I'm sorry.
Where are you in Egypt?
I'm living in Alexandria. I'm sorry.
So it's quite a big city.
Yeah, it's a big city. It's like it's not a countryside. It's a big city, but I mean the whole system is different here. That's
Uh-huh.
why we don't have the like a lot of things like can help us in doing this like to lead the decades, or sometimes we're facing this problem like by our own selves. We don't have like for counselor or something like that, like in the States. Sometimes we really need to do the whole thing with ourselves, not dependent on anyone else.
And how does your school sit within its community? Do you have particular relationships with other groups outside of your immediate school boundary?
No, not at all. We don't have this kind of like like parties or things like that. Sometimes if the teacher like is eager to make his students better, or to communicate with with the community or the other people, he do it himself. Like, but he does it himself. But for like a system or something organized, no, we don't have this.
So what would happen, for instance, if one of your students was on their way to school and did something that they shouldn't do, and a member of the local community saw it
Uh-huh.
and reported it to the school? What would happen in that case?
What would happen in this case, that like the principal or the headmaster are gonna say it's not our responsibility because it happens in outside the school. They're gonna get rid of their responsibility. I mean, like it's not our responsibility. They're gonna say that.
Yeah,
They don't care. Yeah,
I think
they
you
don't
can.
care. No, of course I can, but sometimes I have limits, because if I get into this issue, they're gonna say like it's not your business to talk about it. It's not our problem. Don't put us in trouble.
And
You are an employee here, and you don't have to talk about it. You would bring us a trouble. So that's why I'm sometimes I have to keep silent, or I can just do it. I mean, for me to him outside of like in person, outside of the system or the school.
Okay. And do students in your school wear a uniform?
Yeah, we're in uniform. All
So
the students
if
wear.
they were going to and from school in their uniform, would people in the local community know where they went to school?
Yeah, for sure. They will know.
That's quite interesting. It's quite significantly different then. I think you're right. In England, certainly, if one of our students in my previous school, the current school I have, we don't really wear a uniform as such. The students have a dress code. But if a student was seen misbehaving on their way to school on, say, public transport in their uniform, and a member of the public phoned the school, the student would be potentially in quite a bit of trouble if it had been found that they had actually misbehaved on their way to and from school, even though they weren't on our premises, because they were still wearing our school uniform. So the situation is looked at very different in Egypt.
Yeah, it's totally different. Like the school don't care about the students outside the walls of school. Just like when they get out, they're not belonging there anymore. Like it goes like that. exactly. But sometimes we do the work by ourselves. Like sometimes I feel one of my students have issues, or she suffering, or he's suffering from something, and I talk to their parents in person. Not it's not about school at all. The school actually don't care about it.
Certainly interesting. That's certainly a significant difference, I think, then
Yeah.
between our two systems. That's fantastic to hear, Hannah. Thank you very much for calling in this evening.
Thank you so much. Thank
Good to speak to you. Hassan, what's the context of your school? If students were misbehaving on their way to or from your school, would it be an issue for the school?
Yeah, thank you very much, sir. I'm originally from Somalia, and we have lots of schools, and I live in Mogadishu, the capital city of the country. Kids are always back and forth from schools, and on their way they do a lot of stupid stuff. They do really reckless stuff that people who are in the neighborhood or who live in the surroundings of the school do not really appreciate. So the school system in Somalia is like students are like, I mean, they rule the school. Like students, most of these schools are private schools, so they pay tuition fees, they pay school fee. So therefore, it's sort of like a business. Like kids are like the ones who are rolling the ball. Kids are the ones who are doing things, and they do a lot of bad things. But at the same time, some schools are really taking responsibility for their students, and they give them orientations, they give them awarenesses about how to deal with the people, how to like do not do any disturbing thing, any harmful thing to other people, and also the environment. It's really an issue, and they always talk about in the morning assembly and also in classes at the same time. Teachers are told um, to educate their kids not only in the subject they're teaching, but also in how to live peacefully with other people and not cause any harm.
Yeah, I think that's an essential thing to do, isn't it? It's essential to remind our students in our schools that they have a role to play in the community. They're in our school community, and then when they leave our school community, they're going to go out into the wider community of the local area. So I think you're right. It's an important thing to train them in. If you were in this position, then, so let's just, I suppose, more generalize the scenario. So let's say here a student has committed some damage in the garden of a neighbor while retrieving his football.
Uh-huh.
How do you think you would manage this scenario here? What do you think we could do to make things better in terms of the relationship between our school and our neighbour? Because, of course, we don't want our neighbours hating us. They may in future oppose any planning policy developments we have on building new buildings. How might you manage it, do you think?
Exactly, it's one thing that's really missing from our schools and also our the schools neighbors. They don't really they don't have that chemistry and also the relationship that they should sit down and talk about stuff like that. Kids do a lot of reckless things, as I've already mentioned, and the school they curse the school, the kids, and also they hate them so much, and like they sometimes even campaign for the school to move away from their neighborhood. And what I should do if I was in one of the principals of the schools, I'd just have I'd just make a very good relationship with the neighbor, because it's where I want my school to grow, and also and also make a committee, like a committee of the neighbors, like so they can feel an ownership, like they feel like a membership in the school, and like they feel they own the school. And if the kids do anything that they don't really like, then they might put up with it, because it's going to happen at the end of the day, because kids, nobody can predict, they're unpredictable, they are going to do stuff that out of nowhere, so nobody can expect what they're going to do or what their next move is going to be. So what I say is, like, what I do is like to form a very good relationship with a neighbor. That's what I do, and in the first place. And then if anything, any matter rises out of out of nowhere, I just would just be able to handle it, because we've already had the relationship and the channel is open.
Yeah, that's a really nice idea. I'm particularly keen on this idea of having some kind of committee of the school so that you are building relationships with your local community and your neighbours all the time. I mean, in the UK, of course, most of our secondary schools, certainly even more so some of our primary schools, carry the name of the neighbourhood in the school title. So if, I don't know, let's pick a name, let's say Newtown. If Newtown School is seen negatively, then the people of Newtown may be quite unhappy that the bad behaviour of students at Newtown School is being covered in the local press, because it brings the whole place down, doesn't it?
Exactly. Yeah, that's very true. So
Is
like,
it the
because
same in your place? Do you also have schools that carry the name of their community?
yeah, but we do have, but like for example, in Mogadishu, where I live, which is the capital city of the country, like there are around 300 schools, and they don't really care. Most of them don't really have the name of the places they are located. But you might see a school named Mogadishu, the city's name, but not just like in the villages and the districts they locate. They don't really take the names, which is really something that's missing. I think that's a good idea. I'm gonna take that into my note because it's very important. That's how the people in the neighborhood can feel an ownership. It's really a good thing, because they would feel like it's their school other than some school that's there. But they don't do that mostly.
Yeah, I think your idea of having committees is good. I think it gives people a stake in the school, the community a stake in the school. In our particular system in the UK, most of our schools have governing boards that are made up of members of the local community or particularly interested members of the community. So there is always some link that schools in the UK are looking to establish with their local community. It's been fantastic to hear your thoughts on this, Hassan. Are you a new listener to the show?
Yeah, I am new, really, and also it's saying to me, so thank you for listening. If you like, I have a note here. If you like this show, lend your support. And when I try to send a gift, I cannot because it says you don't have, and you don't have enough like gold. So how do I buy gold? How can I make this thing work? I really.
I think if you listen to a few more shows, Hassan, then you may well find that indeed your gold pile starts to build up. But we broadcast every Wednesday evening from 10:30 UK time, from 10 o'clock until 11 UK time. And once a month, I like to look at crisis scenarios. And that's what our show has been tonight. So we've gone through 6 crisis scenarios. We put you in charge of the school and we ask how we might possibly solve some of the problems that could be thrown our way. And it's absolutely fascinating to hear an international perspective because, of course, I spend most of my working week in Northern England managing issues that come up in English schools. So it's been fantastic to hear your ideas, Hassan, tonight, and fantastic to hear from Hannah as well this evening from the perspective of Egypt. And please, by all means, do listen to the show next week when we'll be doing something slightly different. Please do listen to the other shows of my esteemed colleagues. And next time we have a crisis series to negotiate, I'll be looking to people like yourself to help me solve some of these problems. It's been great hearing from you tonight, Hassan.
Thank you very much, and thank you for your hospitality. It's been really an honor for me to talk to you, and I follow the Teachers Talk, and I'll be around at any time, any moment, whenever you are alive. Thank you.
Perfect. Good to hear from you. And if you click onto the website, ttradio.org, you'll find a list of all of our other shows, and you'll find out a little bit more about some of the hosts too. So thank you very much for calling this evening.
Thank you, sir. Bye-bye.
Good night. Well then, listeners, that brings us to the end of another show. a slightly unusual show, a show when none of my jingles, none of my news clips, and none of my sound effects were working, but a show in which we've had two fantastic callers helping us to look at some of the issues that arise in crisis management scenarios, both in the UK and internationally. So on our next crisis management show, which is due in about another month's time, then we'll be looking again to contributions from our callers to help us solve these issues. Next week's show, I'm hoping, will be an interview show on the issue of education in prison scenarios. I'd be interested about how education in prisons works in the UK and internationally. If anyone is involved in that directly, then please do drop me a note on Twitter. Do call into the show and we will see what comes up. So thank you very much, everybody, for listening tonight. A slightly different kind of show, but it's been really a fantastic educational experience for me hearing from our two callers tonight. Just remains for me to say thank you for listening. I've been Christopher Vowles. This has been The Late Late Show. Thank you and good night.